Greathouse here with Unit 2 of our journalism class together. Sorry it has taken a while to get it out, but it's out now, or will be once I'm done publishing this. Today we're going to talk about ethics and the law. So, journalism is one of those kind of gray areas when it comes to um, ethics and the law, because we live in a society with a free press. We have the ability to write what we want without fear of persecution or governmental repercussions or legal repercussions to a point. So today we're going to learn how journalists know right from wrong, what happens when they know but don't do the right thing, the laws that protect people and journalists who make those choices that maybe don't do the right thing, and the laws that protect journalists who guard their sources, which we'll talk about that. And then what these laws mean in the context of a free society and what happens in societies where they don't have a free press. So, news, it's not our job as journalists to always cover good news. It would be really nice if it was. It would be also very easy if it was, right? It would be very easy if the news was just, we saw some dogs today and it was great. Or puppies are cool, right? Here's 8 minutes of puppy videos. But that's not news. News, as we talked about in our first unit, sometimes has to involve conflict. So in this case, it has to cover the good and the bad. Conflict also usually means ethical turmoil. Someone has to be the winner and the loser in a conflict. And as the audience at home, when you're watching a conflict play out, you may not know. Sometimes it's really clear who the good guy and the bad guy is. Sometimes it's not. How does a reporter do the right thing when they are also under pressures like deadlines and making things interesting for the reader and selling newspapers or selling ads or whatever? Journalistic ethics is the idea that journalism should have some kind of standards it follows. Other professions have a set of standards. There are medical standards, there are legal standards of ethics. Journalism doesn't. So it's up. So how do we figure that out, right? How do we come up with that? Well, we kind of come up with what works for us, which isn't really reliable. This isn't the best way to do it. There really should be a standard set of journalistic ethics. There just aren't. So, what do we look at? We look at accuracy. Have you made every effort to get everything in the story correct? Did you dig every hole you could with the time that you had to get everything right? Is the story fair? Does it avoid bias? Does it represent all sides of an issue or conflict? Are you just covering the Republicans side of a debate, or are you covering the Democrat side as well, for example? Honesty. Did you take every avenue possible to get the truth? Did you just take what was convenient at the time and take it as fact? Or did you dig? It kind of goes with the accuracy thing as well. Taste. This is an interesting one because it's really interesting to teach journalism right now because journalism is constantly changing. I mentioned that in Unit 1. And as we teach this course years down the road, it's going to keep changing. But the idea of what is private and what is public when it comes to public figures is very interesting. But does your story cross the boundaries of taste? Does it include dirty laundry the public doesn't need to know about? Does it harm somebody or someone's family or someone's business needlessly? Um, did you use outside sources? And if you used outside sources or other media outlets, did you give those sources credit? A lot of times, if you watch the news and they take another story and kind of repackage it, so like WTHR, the TV station in Indianapolis, will say from our news gathering partners at the Indianapolis Star, because the Indy Star broke the story, but they can't be like, here's a story in the paper and just hold up the paper, right? That'd be pretty boring TV. So they repackage it, add a little bit of video, make it much shorter for the TV audience, but they give the Indy Star credit. And then attribution. Only protect a source when they would be harmed in some way. So if you interview someone and they give you information for the story, you have to attribute them unless they say, "Hey, don't tell my boss this. You can't because I'm going to get fired and I'm actually scared of them." That's where the legal ramifications come into play. Some of the things that journalists fall into that we would classify as misdeeds, things that journalists do that are maybe unethical and in some cases illegal. Plagiarism is the biggest pitfall that you'll fall into as a journalist. Just like schoolwork, right? We don't want you plagiarizing your schoolwork. We don't want you copying someone else's work. I got in trouble for it in high school. A lot of us have. We don't want you just like, here, give me your paper real quick and let me write it down and then put your byline on it in the case of journalism. That's not fair. So plagiarism is a big thing. And so if you're taking someone else's story and just kind of tweaking a few words and making it your own, that's plagiarism. And that's the biggest thing we can fall into, especially when all news sources are covering the same thing. It's really easy to fall into the pitfall of, okay, they've already written it. Let me take what they wrote and then change it. And then you don't change it enough to make it your own. Fabrication. Sometimes journalists just straight up make things up. And that is when it's our job to report facts. That's like the worst thing you could do. Plagiarism happens most often. Fabrication's just straight up storytelling. Go write fiction if you want to, but journalism has to be real. Bias. In the article, you're passing impartial judgment. We always aren't aware of this one. This one can be tricky because let's say it is a case where you in your head feel like it's pretty clear cut, right? There's a good side and a bad side, or a right side and a wrong side, or a pro and a con. You give a bunch of attention to the pro, and then you just kind of mention the con, right? That's not being fair. That is showing bias. Again, it's something that creeps up on us. That's where editors come in and say, hey, you need a little bit more about this because this is really one-sided right now. Your language, how much you balance, how fair you are, what info you don't dig for, or what info you're missing, or if you literally throw opinion into a fact-based article, all of that stuff can come into play. If you have any connection in any way with any source or issue going on in a journalistic piece, you should get another journalist to cover it. That's a conflict of interest. In small towns, when you work for a small town paper, you oftentimes know a lot of the people who you're covering, but you should try to avoid that conflict of interest or the appearance of a conflict of interest anytime you can. Where isn't there a conflict of interest? So I'm going to read these 3 situations. I'm going to give you a second. Tell me, or think in your head, which one isn't a conflict of interest. A, an on-air reporter is registered to vote in an upcoming senatorial election for her state. She covers the state race for her local news station. B, a reporter covers a story about which local hospitals provide the best care for cardiac patients. Hold, please. You gotta love that the Amazon guy decided to, ring the doorbell as if I wasn't going to see a package when I went upstairs. Anyway, B, a reporter covers a story about which local hospitals provide the best care for cardiac patients. Her husband is a cardiologist in one of the hospitals mentioned in her story. C, a reporter for a local paper in Maine writes a piece about the blueberry industry's effect on the state's unemployment rate, and her brother owns a blueberry farm. So take a second. Which one of those is not a conflict of interest? I'll give you 5 seconds. It's A. So just because she's registered to vote in a senatorial election doesn't mean she's not allowed to cover the race. B, a reporter covering local hospitals and especially giving them a value judgment of best care for cardiac patients, she has a vested interest in her husband's hospital being the best. Same thing as the blueberry industry's effect on the unemployment rate. She could unfairly feature her brother in that article. So if someone else is going to cover that, either one of those stories, that's fine. It just has to be somebody else in the newsroom and not these particular journalists. So, okay, pale invasion of privacy. We have to investigate, right? We have to dig. But there's a line that you shouldn't cross. The bad news is we don't always know where that line is. And this has been the subject of lawsuits where journalists and journalistic agencies and newspapers and publications have listened in on phone calls, have searched through dumpsters, have gone into homes without approval. And so those things are kind of clear cut, but sometimes they aren't. And so we have to dig, we have to investigate, but we don't always know where that line is. Payola gifts and checkbook journalism. So payola is when you get paid to cover a story. When I hear the word payola, I think actually of the guy Alan Freed. So Alan Freed was a DJ who invented the term rock and roll. But Alan Freed also had to kind of quit in scandal because it came out that he was being paid by record companies to play certain records more than others, which was unfair to the general public. So he's not a journalist, but businesses trying to pay to get an article favorable to them on the front page and make it look like journalism and not an ad, that's payola. You can also get gifts from businesses or corporations. Again, not right. And also checkbook journalism, where you pay sources for information. You should never pay a source for information because that's then basically buying the answer that you want. Just like the cops should not pay informants because then they're just going to get whatever they want, right? And then misrepresentation, hiding who you are to get a story. It's okay to not say right away that you're a journalist, but eventually it should be known to the person that you are a journalist writing a story and they are going to be, quote, on the record. What are some safeguards we have for these things? One, we have self-regulation. We have to find two sources a lot of times for all of our information. So if you get a fact, you need another source to back it up. You have a corrections department. In every newspaper or magazine, if they mess up, they issue a correction. And that is the worst feeling as a journalist. I've had to do it where you write something, you publish it, it's great, and then the next day you find out, oh, I was wrong. So then you have to, in a little tiny blurb, say, apologies, but on August 14th, I said that it was 900 square feet. It was actually 1,400 square feet, or his name was actually Jimbo. Whatever it might be, there are corrections exist. Codes of ethics. I said there's no universal code of ethics, right? There isn't, but each news agency or state newspaper association or broadcast association has codes of ethics that we can follow. And then there are ombudsmen. Ombudsman is a really fancy term for folks who are the liaisons between an industry and the public, and they kind of look at that industry holistically. My wife deals with an ombudsman in her job. This person is someone who really isn't partial, just wants the job done in the most ethical way possible. And so they look at the whole situation. They're kind of an impartial third party. You can also be tried. Contempt, trespassing, and invasion of privacy are all criminal offenses. If you refuse to give up your sources and it's not protected by a code of ethics, you could be charged with contempt of court. If you go too far and invade that privacy, you could be charged for that in some states and countries. So criminal offenses do exist, and that's another safeguard we have for misdeeds of journalistic ethics. There's also civil offenses. These are things that are just going to cost you money, not jail time. So libel and slander. Libel is when you print something incorrect about somebody in print, and they sue you and say, you said I'm 300 pounds, I'm actually 190, you were just being mean. Boom, that's libel. Slander is when it's said. So again, if it was a broadcast or a podcast or any other kind of cast, that would be slander. So what are some ways we can combat that? What prevents someone from just saying anything that is true but unflattering is libel or slander? Well, it goes to trial, right? You can also say that it was fair use or fair comment. I can say kind of whatever I want because I was just sort of commenting on things. You're a public figure, so you're up for being talked about. I didn't mean anything by it, right? So I didn't mean anything by it as absence of malice. And then also, it's the truth. If someone says, I weigh 190 and you said I weigh 300 and you're just being mean, you could say, get on a scale. let's find out how much you weigh. Or I have this doctor's report that says you weigh 300. I don't know that that would go to trial, but you know what I mean, right? We have recourses for those lawsuits, but the lawsuits do exist for a reason. So, a college newspaper runs an investigative story about school administrators who went on a Hawaiian junket paid for by a wealthy alumnus who has bid on a construction contract to build the new school law center. Key quotes in the story are then used in a big newspaper story about the same situation, but the metropolitan newspaper reporters failed to credit the student reporters and pass off the quotes as their own. It turns out that the student story was wrong and that the administrators paid their own way to the convention. Everyone loses here. The big newspaper loses because they plagiarized. The small newspaper loses because they were wrong. The alumnus loses because they get tossed into the scandal they had no part of, and the administration loses because they get accused of something that they didn't do. So all of this, if you plagiarize or if you lie and if you fabricate, then everyone loses. A blogger who writes about local restaurants fabricates a quote from an imaginary anonymous dishwasher, keyword imaginary, as saying the kitchen would not pass sanitary health standards. The restaurant's owners do an investigation. The blogger claims the dishwasher has to remain anonymous because he's undocumented. The restaurant owners prove that all their workers have immigration papers in order. The restaurant hires a PI who discovers that the blogger is going by an alias and worked for the chef until he was fired. The bloggers harmed the most. They lose credibility, they lose readers and advertisers, hopefully. So you do have a 2.02 quiz on truth or consequences, all of these journalistic misdeeds and things, so make sure that you go in and do that. Your first reporter's reflection. I apologize for the way Unit 1 was set up. Hopefully in the future, I'll re-record Unit 1 and we set it up better. But in this case, I'm going to tell you now what each assignment is and what the expectations are for each one. So for Reporter's Reflection 1, let's look through it together. Motivated by dreams of journalism awards or just everyday professional pressure, journalists sometimes make bad choices and commit ethical breaches. Three of the most infamous fabricators in journalism history are Janet Cook of the Washington Post, Jason Blair of the New York Times, and Stephen Glass of the New Republic. Using your own information finding skills, conduct research to learn how the Post, Times, and New Republic each handled its respective scandal. You can look at the websites of the publications themselves, but be warned, they could be behind a paywall. If you're having trouble finding the information, let me know. We might be able to find something together. Luckily, there are a number of other resources. An ethical scandal like one of these could ruin a newspaper's reputation. In reading accounts of these scandals, you should evaluate how the publication dealt with its employees' ethical violation. Did the publication handle it well? Was there anything the publication should have done differently to prevent it? Once you've researched the scandal, you're ready to write down your observations. So you should include, so you're going to pick one of those scandals, write a 3 to 4 sentence summary of the ethical breach, a paragraph describing how the outlet handled the breach, and a paragraph that explored what might happen, what they could have done to prevent that breach from happening. Okay, so basically 3 paragraphs, a summary of the breach, a paragraph describing how they handled the breach, and a paragraph looking back as to what they could have done differently. Reporter's Reflection 2. Sometimes you're reading a news story and something doesn't just seem right. The story reports on a news event, but you can tell how the reporter feels about the topic. It's not an opinion piece. It's not in the opinion section. It's not labeled as opinion. How can you tell the reporter's point of view? What are the clues? By evaluating the work of professional journalists and busting their bias, you can better control your own opinions and ensure that they are evident only when you mean them to be. So you're going to find a news story that isn't labeled an opinion piece that you think reveals a reporter's bias. These are usually stories that involve hot button issues, right? Hot topics. So get in there. It's okay. No one's going to offend me. But find something that isn't labeled as opinion, but seems opinionated. Once you've found one, you're going to include a link to the story that you've chosen, a paragraph explaining why you think the story reveals reporter's bias, and a paragraph describing how you would rewrite the section to remove the bias. So the Freedom of Information Act allows any citizen to request already public information from the government. It doesn't mean that the government has to give you everything that you ask for. Most of the time, if you submit a Freedom of Information Act request, The state or US government agency that you ask takes forever and then eventually gives you something back that is heavily redacted. If you've ever seen like a spy movie where a document has like a bunch of black lines on it, that is redacting. And so the Freedom of Information Act says that they have to give you they you can request it and they have to give you something back. You have that right, but it can be heavily redacted and maybe not useful to you. Shield laws also exist. The majority of the 50 states have laws that protect journalists from having to reveal their sources, but those are constantly changing. So check your state that you end up writing in to see if subpoenaed, if sued, you would have to provide information on the sources that you use for an article. All sorts of laws and changes have happened over the past 150 200 years to get us to the point. Mainly the Pentagon Papers in 1971 gave us a real big idea of what can happen when the government lets information out. We had shield laws in 72, so the Pentagon folks didn't have to reveal their sources. Watergate in 74, same thing. Someone gave up Nixon, right? Somebody gave up Nixon and his crimes and helped Woodward and Bernstein put all the pieces together, but they were allowed to protect him for a very, very long time. I think 50 years? No, 40 years, 30 years. I forget. When I was in like high school or early college, it came out who the guy was. There was a whole separate book by Woodward and Bernstein about him specifically. And then in 2002, because of the terror threat, 9/11 kind of changes everything. You do have a quiz 2.06 about freedom and fairness, the Freedom of Information Act, and so on. Your third, reporter's reflection. Sometimes reporters and the law don't work well together. Three instances of this: Judith Miller and Valerie Plame, Josh Wolf and street protests, and Walter Pincus and Wen-Ho Lee. In each of those cases, the journalists believed the public had a right to know the story. They had to promise sources protection and anonymity in order to do this. They also think they have a right to withhold information from the government. In the case of Miller and Pincus, you'll focus on shield laws. In the case of Wolf, you'll consider the First Amendment. Once you've done your research, include the name of the case, a paragraph exploring the journalist's dilemma and why they felt compelled to defy the court, and a paragraph about which laws might be involved. And then you have a 2.08 writing assignment where you will choose one of the scenarios listed there and answer the associated questions in a paragraph. So you have 2 quizzes, 3 reporters' reflections, and 1 writing assignment for Unit 2. Thank you so much for watching. As always, comment or email with questions, and I will see you all next time for Unit 3.